to talk about what's been done and what hasn't been done with the state budget. I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you so you can see some of the details of the budget as I go along talking about it. I want to start by talking about the economic cost of COVID-19. I've talked on these calls in the past about how successful our effort to constrain COVID-19 has been in the state. Sadly, thousands of people have died, but if you recall what I've told you in previous weeks, 10 times more people could have died. Our hospitals could have been overwhelmed. And there've been really much more serious repercussions from the COVID-19 disease in terms of our health had we not acted to close businesses and put in place distancing rules for everyone. The consequences, however, have been very severe for the GDP of the state and the whole country. There's an enormous amount we do not know. I'm not going to make any predictions about how deep the gross domestic product loss has been, or even how deep the loss to revenues have been. I'll give you a broad range. And let me quickly remind you why we don't know that much. This economic crisis is very different from many others. It began with what economists call a supply side shutdown. We simply stopped producing things. That is starting to be removed. We know that businesses are starting to reopen. More of them will. We actually don't know how quickly they're going to be opening, however. And we also don't know whether they're going to be closures again in the future. If the disease begins to spread more widely, that might be necessary. So just in terms of the impact of necessary rules and regulations to protect our health on the economy, there's a great deal of uncertainty. But now there's a second level of uncertainty. Once we closed down these businesses, we created a more traditional kind of economic crisis, what economists call a demand side crisis. People are unemployed, even if they're getting some support from the federal government from expanded unemployment insurance, can't consume as much as they have in the past. And that's going to continue for some time, particularly since we don't know how quickly people are going to be reemployed. Even more importantly, as people go back to work, they may not be so quick to spend at the levels they were spending in the past. For one thing, people are scared about a possible second closure. They want to be saving their money. For another thing, they have back bills to pay for rents and for mortgages that they couldn't pay while they're unemployed. And keep in mind that whenever we lose buying power for these reasons, that has further repercussions. It's the multiplier effect in reverse. If I'm unemployed and I can't purchase things, then other businesses shut down. Even if they were allowed to operate, they shut down some of their work, some of their production. They lay off some people just because people aren't buying what they're prepared to sell. So again, there's these repercussions from the supply side shutdown on the demand side, which means that the economic recovery could take a long time to take place. And we don't know how fast people go back to work, how fast people return to spending. And we also don't know how much more federal support we're going to get. We've gotten a lot so far, but it's far less than we need. And that means that the economic recovery at this point will probably be very slow. If we get more federal support, that could change things. But again, Margarida will talk a little bit more in a bit about what we can expect and what we could do to make sure we get the level of support we need. There are varying estimates of the impact of the economic crisis on revenues over the next 2 years. And when you're talking about the budget, don't forget that in addition to loss of revenues, there's higher expenditures, primarily for Medicaid. People losing health insurance is going on Medicaid, either expanded or traditional Medicaid, but also for other costs that are not necessarily all going to be reimbursed by the federal government. The Independent Fiscal Office has recently projected a $4.8 billion revenue loss over the current fiscal year and the fiscal year that begins on July 1st. There are a number of other forecasters who have come up with estimates, and frankly, they range incredibly widely. The lowest one I've seen said we would lose $3 billion in revenues between this year and next year. One other one said we might lose $25 billion of revenues over the 2 years. That's in general fund budget that has $40 billion at the top in terms of spending and revenues. That's probably a $25 billion estimate is probably way too high, but my view is the IFO's estimate of $4.8 billion is probably low. At the moment, we've received about $800 million in Medicaid supplements from the federal government, $4.1 billion in CARES Act money. At this point, none of the CARES Act money can be used to backfill lost budget revenues. There might be some changes through either regulation or through additional legislation in the future. And as we'll see, the state has reserved about $1 billion in CARES Act money and has not committed it yet. So that could be used at some point to fill revenue losses. But again, we don't know whether that's going to happen. And as I've mentioned, we don't know whether there's going to be another round of federal fund support. In light of all these things, the General Assembly made a decision to pass an interim budget. I'm going to tell you what they did, and then I'll explain to you why they did it. Most line items in the budget were funded for 5 months at 5/12 of the 2019-2020 spending rate. That means to say we flat funded most of the budget between now and the end of November. Some things were funded for 12 months, but also, again, at the level of the current year, 2019-2020 budget. Pre-K education was funded for 12 months. The pre-K counts and Head Start programs were funded. K-12 education was funded for 12 months. Funding for basic education funding, Ready to Learn, and other school line items were funded at the last year's rate for 12 months. So was career and technical education and special education. The state system of higher education and the state-related universities and the community colleges were all funded at the same rate as last year. FIA, the Higher Education Assistance Association, which provides loans to college students, was funded at last year's rate for 12 months, and so was some environmental protection provisions in the budget. They were funded at similar rates, and CHIP was funded for 12 months, and so was Military and Veterans Affairs. Now, why did we have a stopgap budget? One reason is simply uncertainty. We don't know, as I pointed out, how bad the economic crisis will be. We don't know its impact on state revenues. So it made sense, just from a technical point of view, to try not to make difficult decisions until we have a better idea of what the circumstances will be found over the course of the 2021 budget year. That is from July 1st to 2020 to June 30th, 2021. But there's also a political element, of course. I think our state legislators were very much trying to avoid making difficult decisions before an election. Had they tried to pass a balanced budget for the whole 12 months, they would have had to either make decisions on new revenues or on deep cuts to the budget. And I think they very much didn't want to have to make those decisions before an election. That has some important implications for us as advocates. We have to make sure that we tell our legislators between now and the end of November, and that means through the election, what we want them to do when they come back and have to make final decisions about the upcoming budget year. I do want to point out, however, that the design of this interim budget or stopgap budget has taken into account some of the politics of the situation. You remember back in 2011, 2012, after federal stimulus money ran out, we had massive cuts in the state budget, $1 billion cut to K-12 education, $300 million cut to higher education, deep cuts to human services. By choosing to flat fund K-12 education, higher education, and some human services through the whole year, our legislators have built-in protections against a repeat of 2011, 2012. It simply won't, even if we don't get any new federal money, and if we're facing a $5 billion budget hole, which, you know, there's the rough number people are using for the second half of the year, there's simply going to be no way to have a repeat of 2011, 2012. By locking in funding for K-12 education, higher education, CHIP, and some other programs for the whole year, and that includes pensions, by the way, and debt service, there's very little left to cut. Most of the biggest parts of the rest of the budget that have only been funded for 5 months is Medicaid spending, both for healthcare and for long-term living for seniors. And that can't be cut unless the General Assembly actually passes a law to reduce benefits, and we are pretty much assured that Governor Wolf would veto such a law. A lot of social service funding can't be cut without losing much more money than we would save from loss of federal matching funds. So I think the one upside of this budget, which as I'll say in a few minutes, doesn't really meet all the needs of Pennsylvanians at this moment. The upside is that we won't be able we won't see a repeat of 2011, 2012. We won't see deep cuts in the budget. And that raises the question of what will they do to finish the rest of the budget? There are basically 4 options. One is to get new federal funds to fund the deep deficit that we expect for the 7/12 that isn't funded. A second is to get new revenues. And as you know, we have repeatedly called for raising taxes on corporations that don't pay any taxes in Pennsylvania, and on the top 1% who pay at half the rate of people in the middle and the bottom of the income scale. Another alternative is borrowing. And as we will point out in a report we're releasing next week, we do think that this is a good time for the state to not try to solve a budget crisis all in 1 year, but to borrow funds to tide us over until the economy recovers. There are a number of ways we can borrow money. There may be a possibility of borrowing through a new Federal Reserve facility for state and local governments. It's also possible that we could securitize tobacco fund revenues, liquor control board revenues, and raise substantial sums of money that would tide us over until the economy recovers. Of course, borrowing on state revenues means that we will have less revenue in future years to fund the operating expenses of the budget, because we're going to have to be paying back the money that we've borrowed. And as you know, we've had a structural deficit for some time. We've had great difficulty balancing budgets for the last 10 years. We've been using all kinds of budget gimmicks to balance those budgets. As I've pointed out, underestimating Medicaid caseloads is an art form in this state as a way of balancing budgets. So any borrowing, even if it's a good idea now, will put us deeper in the long-term budget hole. So at some point, we are definitely going to need new revenues. And I think one of the things we ought to be talking about as we continue our budget advocacy over the summer through the election and to next year is the necessity of finally fixing our tax system so that we can raise substantial new revenues from corporations in the top 1%. The last alternative is budget cuts. And as I point out repeatedly on these calls, we think that's a terrible idea. Cutting, not only do we need all the what we spend on education, higher education, human services to protect the economic future of the state and to protect the most vulnerable people in the state, cutting the budget now would deepen our economic crisis because we put many people out of work who would not work for the state or work for social service agencies that are funded by the state. So that is the last alternative. And as I pointed out, one of the good things about the budget we just passed is that it makes deep budget cuts almost impossible. Going on to the other important action that was taken last week, the General Assembly did a partial distribution of the $4 billion of Federal CARES Act money. $2.9 billion of it has been distributed. About $1.1 billion is being held in reserve. On these slides, I tell you quickly where that money is going. I'm going to give a few more details, but not a lot today because it actually gets quite complicated. We will be putting out a full analysis of the Federal CARES Act distribution on Monday as part of a general analysis of the budget that we just passed. But just very briefly, $150 million goes to the Commission on Crime and Delinquency, and that's going to be used for the School Safety and Security Fund to clean and sanitize schools. $40 million goes to the Department of Agriculture. It's going to be used half for the state food purchase program and half for a dairy assistance program. That's going to help dairy farmers, but also the money's going to help people who are need help feeding their families right now. $930 million goes to the Department of Community and Economic Development. The biggest chunk of that is $625 million for county block grants. This is to fund the 61 counties in the state that did not receive direct money from the Federal CARES Act, and it's distributed on the basis of population. There's $225 million here for a small business assistance program, $10 million for food access initiative, and $50 million for hazard pay for frontline workers. The Department of Education gets $9 million, half for pre-K counts and half for Head Start. The Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education gets $30 million to reimburse universities for the costs incurred as a result of the COVID-19 emergency. The Higher Education Assistance Agency gets, I think the total is almost $40 million. I couldn't put on slides, sorry. Some of that is for student loan interest forbearance. FIA held private loans for Pennsylvania borrowers that are not in default will be put in a fund in which borrowers will not have to pay costs until the end of November, I believe. Till the end of September. That'll protect some of our students who are not able to pay back their student loans. $5 million there goes to the Higher Education for Disadvantaged Act, and some goes to just expanding the FIA state grant program. The Department of Health gets $20 million rather. That's $10 million for community-based health centers and $10 million for vaccine development. Department of Human Services gets over $1 billion. That's mostly being distributed to long-term care facilities, personal assistance services, county and non-public nursing homes, assisted living residences. Some money's going for ventilators and tracheostomy providers. There's $175 million for a new program of health collaboratives, which is to protect the residents of long-term care facilities from getting the COVID-19 disease. In addition, there's money for intellectual disabilities programs, over $260 million there. Money for critical access hospitals, for domestic violence programs, for homeless assistance, and for legal services. PEMA, the Emergency Management Agency, gets $100 million. The Housing Finance Agency gets $175 million for mortgage and rental assistance. This is one of the better programs in here that's going to help renters with $750 a month for 6 months. That's the maximum award for those who need it to help pay their rent. And people who have mortgages will be eligible for up to $1,000 per month for 6 months if, as a result of COVID-19 economic disaster, they can't pay their mortgages. And then there's $300 million to provide property tax relief. This is designed to replace the money that in the past has come from the casinos which funds school districts to enable them to reduce property taxes for people whose property taxes are particularly high. There was some concern that without that casino money, property tax relief would be impossible, but they've decided to put up to $300 million from the Federal CARES Act money into that program to replace the lost revenues. Education funding has two parts. There's a Title I supplement that of $471 million that goes to all schools in the state in proportion to the amount of money they get through Title I. And then there's a $200 million emergency school health and safety grant program. Each school district gets a certain amount of money, as described in the slide. I won't read that to you. But the key point I want to make is the Title I money is a really good program in that it will get money to schools that really need it. We're very concerned that the emergency school health and safety grant program is just distributing money equally to schools, both those schools that are well-funded and those that are very much not well-funded. As you know, in Pennsylvania, we have the highest inequality K-12 education funding in the whole country. And we are concerned about spending that school health and safety grant funds in a way that doesn't take into account the disparities in how we fund education now. So I'm going to stop there right now and just say one last thing, and that is that obviously the budget's not done and there's a lot of advocacy that has to be done about that. But there's also a lot of advocacy that has to be done about a lot of other things. In the next couple of weeks, you're going to see the We the People campaign and House, Senate, and Democratic leaders putting forward a broad agenda to create a just recovery in the state. We're calling it What People Need, What Pennsylvania Needs, rather. And we are going to be calling for greater investments in all kinds of areas, health, education, workers, and increasing the minimum wage for workers that we think will create a just recovery for Pennsylvania from this COVID-19 economic disaster. So the budget fight's not done by any means. Not only do we have to fix the last 7 months of the budget that hasn't been funded, but we need to be talking about going beyond flat funding of budgets and greater investments and finding the revenues for those greater investments by taxing the rich in order to create, as we say, the Pennsylvania people need and a just recovery for all of us. So I'll stop there. I'm sorry I've gone on a little long, but if there's some questions, I can take them.
Sure, Mark. We have a question. We have several questions, actually. We'll try to do as many of these as we can. So questioners, if you can ask very concisely, that would be very helpful. The first question we're going to get is from Nathan. Nathan, I've unmuted your line, and you can ask your question now.
Oh, well, first of all, thanks for holding this, and Mark, thanks for all that presentation, great information. So in terms of revenue for the state, do you think there is any chance, given our current legislature, that they might entertain some revenue increases through fair taxation or corporate taxation, or are we just going to be looking at to expect just budget cut proposals out of that? What might you anticipate? What can you tell us?
Well, two things. One is, given the decisions made about where to fund the budget for the whole year, there's just not a lot of room to cut. So if we don't get federal funds to make up the rest of the deficit, and again, the number everyone throws around is $5 billion, but it could be a lot more. They're going to have to find revenues from somewhere, and necessity is the mother of invention. Even Republicans who resist taxing the rich and taxing corporations may recognize that they don't have much choice. The second thing to say is we have an election in November. The General Assembly after November may look very different. As you know, we have a C4 arm that's trying to make sure that General Assembly looks very different, but this is a C3 call, so I won't talk much about that anymore. But it really depends on what the people of Pennsylvania do. I think the most important thing for all of us over the next couple of months, and this is something C3 folks can say, is we have a budget crisis. At some point, the only way to solve the budget crisis, not just the immediate one, but the long-term budget crisis, is to raise revenues. And even more importantly, the only way to create a fair recovery, an economy that works for everyone in the state, is to raise the revenue so that we can fund education and healthcare and housing in ways that we have not been doing in the state up to this point.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for your question, Nathan. We're going to go to another question from Desi. Desi, you can unmute your line now and ask your question.
Thank you. My question was if there's a sense of when the rental and mortgage assistance will become available, and if there's any idea of how folks will be applying for that and what people should be preparing to apply for that.
So I do not know. I'll be honest. Things happened so fast last week with this budget and then the CARES Act distribution that there's been very little information about the details of the programs. There's been very little information about what actually was being spent on. I spent a lot more time in the details of reading legislation really carefully than I usually do to prepare this, because there were no summaries. So I do not know. As soon as we find out, we will share that information with everyone.
Thank you for your question. Another question from Joe. Joe, I'm going to unmute your line now.
Okay, great. Hey, Mark. Joe Willard from PEC in Philadelphia.
Hi.
Do you know in your reading of the legislation of CARES, is there any rule that the counties cannot supplant dollars, i.e. using federal dollars and then cutting their local general fund dollars?
In general, the CARES money is supposed to be used for new funding that is not in place. There are rules that say you can't use the CARES money to backfill lost revenues. So I think a county that tried to say, all right, we're going to use the CARES money, but we're going to cut the money we've been spent would be violating the spirit of that law right now. And I think you'd have certainly a political case to make and maybe even a legal case at some point if counties really tried to do that. Is there another question, Jeff?
I'm sorry, I forgot to unmute my line. I was just saying we'll take a couple questions here. We have a question from Art. Art, I think I've unmuted your line. You can ask it directly.
I'm interested in criminal justice reform.
Mm-hmm.
Any investments that could be earmarked for that cause?
There are none that I know of in the decisions that were made in the last week. I do know that legislators are talking about criminal justice reform right now in a much more serious way than they have in the past. So I would expect further initiatives along these lines. I know there are efforts in Philadelphia, for example, to push back against Mayor Kenny's plan to spend another $14 million on the Philadelphia Police Department. I don't know what kinds of actions might be put forward at the state level to shift how we fund criminal justice, or to put in place certain reforms that would help prevent the kind of racial injustice and the horrifying murders that we've seen around the country and frankly in Pennsylvania in the last couple of years. We do have a proposal for criminal justice reform that maybe we in our We the People campaign big book, and maybe someone could share that with you. So we have some ideas about what kinds of reforms would be necessary to create a decent, fair, and equitable criminal justice system in the state. But I think we're just at the beginnings of those discussions right now in terms of what state legislators might be interested in doing.
We're going to take a question from Tom and then one final question from Eric. Tom, you can go ahead.
Thanks, Jeff. Mark, it sounds like the way you described that the CARES money is being spent, it sounds like it's going to expensed items. My history is correct on what happened in 2008 with the Great Recession. There was stimulus money coming into the state, but it was used in some cases that incurred costs to carry, even in hiring some people. And of course, then what that meant when the stimulus stopped, we had to do layoffs, and that included layoffs of teachers, et cetera. So from what I've heard, though, it sounds like we're not making that same mistake. We are using the money appropriately where it's one-time expenses to fix something that had some pain because of COVID. Is that correct?
Right. The big difference here is exactly what you said. The ARA money during the Great Recession was mostly used to backfill lost revenues. And that's why the big budget cuts didn't happen in Pennsylvania until 2011, 2012, when the ARA money ran out. Most of the CARES Act money has been used to fund relief programs tied to the disaster created by COVID-19, and it hasn't been used to backfill. They have reserved $1 billion, however, and there's some discussion, and Margarida may talk about this a little more, in Washington about possibly loosening some of the restrictions so that some of the money could be used to backfill. You know, it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, we don't want to see budget cuts immediately because there's not enough money coming into the state through tax revenues. So federal funding to help would be very useful. On the other hand, as you pointed out, if we rely on federal money and it runs out in a year or so, and the economy is not recovered, we will be facing deep budget difficulties a couple of years from now. My view is we're going to face deep budget difficulties one way or the other, and we must fix our tax system and raise the revenue so that we can not only fund what we currently fund, but invest much more deeply in making education fair and higher education fair, in housing and many other areas that I've talked about.
All right, the last question we're going to have for Mark is coming from Eric. Eric, your line's unmuted. Go ahead.
Thank you, Jeff. Eric Elliott, PSCA. Hi, Mark. On the slide labeled education funding, you list a couple of line items that's coming out of CARES Act money. Do you understand that to be in addition to the CARES Act money that's you showed as being allocated on the previous two slides, or a subset of that?
No, that's in addition. There's the CARES Act included, you know, I mean, when I last counted 13 or 14 different pots of money. So the CARES Act distribution was that I mostly talked about first comes out of the 2.6, and then they added 300 million, so 2.9 billion of spending. And then the last two items, the Title I supplement and the safety money, those are two other pots of money. So they are not part of the 2.9 billion rather.
Thanks for your question, Eric. Mark, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce Margarida.
Thanks. So we have a real treat today. Margarida Jorge has been a friend of mine for a long time. We work closely together on the Healthcare for America Now campaign. She's one of the best informed people in Washington and one of the great leaders of progressive advocacy in the whole country. She's someone we rely on at PBPC a great deal to guide our own federal advocacy. And she's just a wonderful person. So I'm really happy to have her join us on this call.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. All right. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to talk to the Pennsylvania team. And, you know, Pennsylvania is a state where HCAN had a huge campaign. It was really a model campaign that books have been written about and people ask me about all the time. So it's fantastic to always be able to point to the fantastic work that you guys have done on healthcare budget and other issues. So I'm going to do sort of two things. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's passed in terms of the federal relief packages we've seen so far. And then I'm going to talk a lot about the political context that we're in. And I'm going to talk about that because if you've worked with me before, you will know that my point of view is that we have tremendously smart people working in government and tons of smart advocates, many advocates who I think are actually smarter than a lot of the people actually working in government. And generally, when problems are not solved, it's not because we don't know how. The problem generally is that there's a challenge with political will. And so I really want to talk about that because I feel like we are in a moment where it is only going to be by organizing and aligning people at the local, state, and federal level that we really get the type of relief and recovery that we're going to need to bring the country forward. So let's first talk a little bit about what's happened so far here in Washington. And I am going to share my screen with you. And now in the age of, I'm low tech, but now in the age of Zoom, this is like a thing that everybody knows how to do, which is, you know, fantastic. So just, you know, what is our current context? We all know this, right? Just a couple million people who have been identified with COVID, you know, 107,000 deaths. I think this is today's number. It's more deaths than any other country. Huge numbers, really unprecedented, no one in living memory remembers unemployment like this. So, you know, I think right now, I just was on the phone with some of the labor partners this morning. It's around 40 million people. And keep in mind that almost all the numbers, I just nodded when Mark said we don't have a lot of information. We really don't have a lot of information, and we don't have a lot of good capacity to measure things. Even on things like the unemployment numbers, we're pretty sure that 40 million really underrepresents how many people have been either laid off or terminated or in some other way have lost hours on their jobs. So the scope of impact in terms of the economic impact is really tremendous, very challenging to measure. On healthcare, obviously this is a public health crisis. We're seeing lots of people lose their health coverage. State and local governments facing at least a $650 billion shortfall, likely an underestimate. The damage is probably going to be even bigger than that. You know, at the national level, we have completed 4 packages. I'm just going to go through them quickly in the next slide, but we are now pushing for the next package, and we don't think that the next package will be the last package. We think there will be more that is required after that. The key things that we've heard the president say, I've just listed a few things here. I listed them because they're so different than the things that we talk about. But a key thing that the president is advocating for is a payroll tax cut. And so just speaking sort of broadly, we know that almost always when we're in an economic crisis, what the Republicans will advocate for the most is tax cuts to stimulate the economy, right? That is sort of part of their ideology. We've seen them do it over and over again. The president, we've seen some tax cuts already in the relief packages. The president has been stuck on this payroll tax cut. He really, really wants it. It's not like the worst thing ever, but it's not also very helpful given that it's not going to do much to help, say, the 40 million people that have lost their jobs. So Majority Leader McConnell, and as you all know, there's a Republican majority. The Republicans control the Senate. So literally nothing comes to the floor in the Senate unless the Republican leadership supports it. The majority leader in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, mostly has been talking about legal immunity for employers. That's his sort of like #1 jam right now. There's a lot of growing bipartisan support for more aid to state and local governments. We're hearing that a lot from governors, from mayors, city council people, agencies. So there is growing clamor around that, but so far we have not had a commitment to any further relief. So let's just take one quick second and look at what's already passed. And I know this is small, but I'll just run through it. We've had 4 packages pass in about the span of 6 weeks. Now, I'm just going to tell you, as a person that works in Washington all the time and works on legislation all the time, and with Mark and thousands of other people work to pass the Affordable Care Act. It literally was, I felt like I was in a movie watching these packages pass, right? After President Trump being elected in 2017, the sort of polarized conditions in Congress, we have not seen a bill of this scale, I mean, pick any of them really, pass with this speed in I don't even know if it's ever happened, right? And so it's really incredible. We had been joking on a lot of even the sort of smaller reforms that we want on prescription drugs or that we want on ACA, that, the Senate, the US Senate is like a graveyard, right? It's a graveyard of buried hopes. It's a graveyard of legislation. Anything that goes over there just gets buried. It's impossible to get something out. So watching legislators in an extremely polarized environment pass what amounts to about $3 trillion, just over $3 trillion in spending in this span of time was really incredible. And I think speaks to just how intense and scary and dangerous the pandemic is, both for people's health and for public health, but also for economic conditions in the country. So the first one that passed was the bill that passed on March 6th. It's got a super long name. And mostly that was all healthcare stuff. And that was an $8.3 billion bill, lots of sort of immediate stuff on testing, treatment, social distancing, a lot of healthcare. We then saw the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. That was also pretty sizable, lots of stuff in there about Medicaid. There was stuff in there about paid leave that was pretty disappointing, but, you know, something. So, you know, a bunch of mishmash in there, and you can see some of it here. One really important thing that I want to mention that is related to the conversation that you guys are having about what you can and can't use the money for, and what is appropriate in terms of using money to backfill or to increase state flexibility to cut some things while receiving public money for other things. In the past, historically, we've seen that happen with Medicaid increases during natural disasters or crises. In the Families First Response Act, one thing that was a very positive thing that was included in the legislation was a provision on maintenance of effort in Medicaid. That's really incredible. I mean, I don't really think I need to point out to you all, but I don't take it for granted anymore since I've been working in Washington, that one doesn't have to say obvious things. Frequently, we do have to say obvious things, but in a public health crisis, it's good to get more people to get more health care. It's bad to take away people's health care. So pretty basic. So the maintenance of effort provision guarantees that any state that takes this money will not be taking the money while cutting services, eligibility, or coverage for other folks in the state, which sometimes governors want to do because they've got big holes in their budgets, or they may be conservative governors that inherited Medicaid programs that they feel are bloated programs, and they want to trim the programs, and they see this as an opportunity. So I just want to mention that because I'm going to come back to it. It's one of the things that's at stake in the next package. Then we saw the huge package, the CARES Act, right? That was a $2.3 trillion package, tons of things in there. Really a very interesting package, some unprecedented legislation in there. Certainly the unemployment stuff in there we've never seen anything like that. We've never had unemployment provisions that cover gig workers or contracted workers. We've never had a provision that would fully compensate people for the time that they were not working through no fault of their own because of COVID. Lots of money for state and local governments to deal with the aftermath of COVID. So tons and tons and tons. And if people want details on these, there is so much policy details on these that I can send you. I'd be happy to do it. So it was a very large package. And I think for a lot of people, set a precedent for what could be accomplished in terms of relief. And I think for Democrats, they looked at that package and they thought, this is a great starting point. Understanding that the impact of this thing is going to be tremendous, we need a bunch more like that. I think Republicans did not share that experience and had a different point of view, and we're seeing that play out now. And then the fourth package that was a smaller one that passed, much more incremental, was mainly more funding for hospitals and healthcare providers, more money for the small business programs. Everybody was hoping that that would be CARES Part 2, but it really didn't end up that way. It ended up being a much smaller scale package. And I think that is the point at which we started to see a divergence between Republicans and Democrats in terms of their sense of urgency around the package and the scale of relief that was needed. Okay, just a couple more things. Obviously, we need a lot more. Where we are right now is with Democrats in the House having passed another large package, that's the $3 trillion HEROES package. This one package is almost as large as all the previous ones I just laid out. And this would double down on a lot of the things that are already in CARES and provide more money for a longer duration. So things like unemployment, improved provisions on paid leave, bigger increase in FMAP match in Medicaid for the state, $500 billion in funds for state and local governments with some increased flexibility about how they might use that. So lots and lots of stuff in the COVID Act. This act was a little bit contentious on the House side, and the politics on the House side, the contention really derived from two places. One is a set of more moderate lawmakers who thought that $3 trillion was excessive, right? So you're always going to have the folks that are more austerity, fiscal responsibility and austerity, and spending this much money in this period of time makes them extremely nervous. And then you have a set of more progressive legislators who just feel like it's not big enough, and we need to really, really make it bigger and to turn this relief package into a stimulus package. And I want to be really careful in thinking about that language because you know, here in Washington, a relief package is not the same thing as a stimulus package. And it's not talked about the same way. The politics are very, very different. And the way House leadership has been thinking about this package, though it's a very sizable package, is that we are still in the relief and recovery phase, right? That the goal here is to get in enough money to really deal with immediate needs and immediate fallout, and enough money that we can start a real recovery, right? So that we don't make the same mistake that we made in the recession where we underspent, right? And in fact, went the other way. We started cutting things, which then slowed down the economy deep into the recession. I think there is some learning here in Washington, including a lot of economists, even middle of the road economists, saying it would be far worse to not spend enough and force cuts deep in the recession as opposed to just spending more and kickstarting the economy. So there is a lot of conversation about that. This package passed, back on whatever it was, May 13th. We haven't seen any movement yet. Here's some of the good stuff that's in it. Everybody was waiting to see what the Senate would do. Well, here's what the Senate is saying. So President Trump is saying, nope, no go, dead on arrival. We're not doing anything with that. Mitch McConnell, not the most sympathetic guy when it comes to state budgets, has said, go ahead and file bankruptcy, Pennsylvania. We don't really care. Your problem, not our problem. And, you know, he's citing issues around, you know, we can't afford it. It's too big. What are we going to do? Blah, blah, blah. Let's wait and see. I just really want to double down on the revenue point here that Mark made. And, you know, people that work with me know that I also co-chair the tax coalition here in Washington. And there's a reason for that. The reason for that is because I don't believe that we can expand healthcare in the way that we need to in this country without raising taxes. It's just not going to happen. And that's aside from COVID. Long before COVID came around, there is a major revenue crisis in this country. And in the CARES package, we passed a lot of great things. But one thing I just want to call people's attention to, because it hasn't gotten a lot of attention, the CARES package included the reopening of a loophole that had been closed in the Trump tax law that funneled $135 billion to real estate firms, hedge funds. These are all LLCs. Basically they're all LLCs. They're pass-through businesses, the like of, sort of like what President Trump operates, right? It's a series of pass-throughs. $135 billion is more money than was spent on all the safety net programs together in the CARES package. It's more money than hospitals got, and we're in a public health crisis. So this is a lot of money that got given away to rich people right before Mitch McConnell got up and said we can't afford to give people more stuff to deal with COVID. I also want to mention the Trump tax law, which of course, funneled $1.9 trillion, mostly to rich people and corporations. All of that to say that when we are in a fight about spending, the best thing that we could do is zoom out and talk about revenue, right? If we want to avoid austerity, we want to avoid the politics of shrinking the government and making more cuts, laying people off, taking away services, because legislators say that that's what we have to do to get through this crisis. It's a crisis, we have to tighten our belts. Our response should always be, that's nonsensical. This is the richest country in the world, we have plenty of money. We should stop giving it to rich people and spend it on relief and recovery. So the last thing that I'll say, because I know we have to move to questions, is the number one challenge that we have is to create enough urgency to get Republicans back to the table to start negotiating on the next package. The longer that takes, the harder it's going to be and the smaller scale we can expect when it comes to reform. The second most important thing that we can do is to keep fighting hard for a big package. It may seem counterintuitive, but we are better served by fighting hard for a big package in as quick a timetable as possible than a series of small ones, which politically becomes very, very hard. So I'll just stop there and maybe folks will have questions.
Thank you, Margarita. We have an initial question here from Desi. I'm going to call on Desi now. You can unmute your line.
I think you talked about it a little bit, but just if you could give a sense of the how much of through these different packages, how much went to the wealthy and to corporations versus poor and working people?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to say I don't have a precise number, and also we don't actually know, frankly, because some of it is sort of uncovered as we implement. But so I will say this, like I I overall am pretty happy with the packages. And I think that overall they're very strong packages and a lot went to people. But more went to rich people than should have gone to rich people, right? Including a whole bunch of loopholes in legislation that then created opportunity for some of these corporations to game the system. And we've all heard the Ruth's Chris anecdote. So I think there's a lot of gaming the system and a lot of privilege and advantage for these corporations. I want to distinguish between that, though, and this just deliberate tax giveaway that reopened a loophole that had been closed, right? This is just an out-and-out giveaway to a very specific group of rich people who are basically real estate magnates and hedge fund managers. It's about 44,000 people. So I think that's really something to watch out for in future packages, because to get these guys back to the table, we're going to need to negotiate. And frankly, you know, and I say this in a bipartisan or nonpartisan spirit, we often have as much trouble with the Democrats when it comes to these tax giveaways as we do with Republicans. So it is a really important thing to watch.
Thanks, Margarita. There's a question that was put in the box asking if there's a link to any kind of report or information about that giveaway to the millionaires that you just referenced.
There is, and if you all go on to the Americans for Tax Fairness website and you just type in millionaires giveaway, you will get a ton of analysis about where the money comes from, you know, what was the origination of this loophole, everything you could want to know.
Thanks, Margarita. And I see that my colleagues have already jumped on that and put that in the chat box. So folks can click on that link there. You may want to copy that. We will send out a recording of today's webinar to everyone, along with the transcript of all the public Zoom chat that we've had here today. So folks will be able to find the links there as well. We do have a question here from Tom. Tom, I'm going to unmute your line. If you can unmute it on your end, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Yep, thanks, Jeff. I was just wondering what advice we can do to change some of the systemic things going on where, I mean, this is the first I'm hearing about that this millionaire package was available or put in there, millionaire giveaway to hedge fund managers and all. And we're not seeing this on the regular news cycles. We don't hear even Democrats who are being analyzed on CNN who are talk about what things have gone wrong with some of them. So, I mean, where can we as advocates, we all are advocating for different things, but how can we advocate for these things ahead of time when the negotiations are going on? And this is what some Democrats and or Republicans are talking about, and it seems to be unfair. How do we make that known so that people can call their legislators in advance and try to prevent some of that legislation?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I will say we have more opportunity right now than we've had in any other relief package because these relief packages move so quickly, right? Really like $3 trillion in a span of 6 weeks. Most of this didn't get negotiated out in the open the way we're used to seeing when we were fighting for the Affordable Care Act or on some of these other pieces of legislation. It all basically got decided behind closed doors with 5 or 6 people. And so there wasn't much of an opportunity to advocate. So one thing I say to people all the time, don't wait to start hearing in the news what's happening. You should be in touch with your legislators now and make your position clear now on all of these issues. Between now and the time that we have a next COVID relief package, we are going to have time to advocate. And so one thing that I would really encourage, stay in touch with your allies at this table, right? Like these guys know the federal stuff, they know the state stuff, they have access to federal resources. Every single person that is advocating for the next relief package should say, we need X, Y, and Z things. We need this amount of money for the state and local government. We need FMAP. And by the way, you need to repeal this $135 billion that you just gave to rich people that is coming out of the pockets of the poor and working class who are facing job losses and economic devastation that is so difficult to even predict. So I think you do have time right now that we didn't have before, but I always say to people, don't wait for the Republicans or the Democrats to come out with their package. You be in touch with your lawmaker now and you tell them what's important to you and you be clear about that with your colleagues so that everybody is doing that in a shared way, because legislators are still very, very responsive to constituent pressure. So that's our leverage.
Thanks so much for your question, Tom. And thank you to you, Margarita. This has been very helpful. A number of folks have made some comments in the chat to us. This is a really great opportunity, as you mentioned, for folks to keep an eye on what's going on and to really advocate. We've put some links in there to the action that we're taking with our newest campaign, which is the 99% Pennsylvania. Right now, we're doing an initial push on Senator Toomey and Senator Casey to support the HEROES Act. We will probably be updating this and fine-tuning this, but for now, we really want them to understand the scale of the relief and recovery package that we'd like to see. We're going to continue to amp up the pressure on that. I would encourage folks who want to stay informed and want to know about things before they happen to follow and like the 99% Pennsylvania on our Facebook page. We also have a Twitter account for the 99% Pennsylvania. You can follow that there. Anyone who takes action, by the way, on the current action that we have will be added to an email list for updates on that. So again, we really want to thank Margarida Jorge for taking the time to be here today. We've gone a few minutes past 2 o'clock, but if you have additional follow-up questions, you want to get them to us, we'll be glad to pass those along to her. Again, we'll be making the video available as well as the chat transcript. I do want to provide an opportunity here for folks to take action right now, and this is a critically important one. Time is running out. Like, you need to do this like right now before this meeting ends. And our colleague from Pennsylvania Health Access Network, Jennifer Wolf, is going to tell you about that right now. Jennifer, go ahead. Thought I unmuted Jennifer. Let me unmute again. I think you need to unmute it on your end.
Oh, is that better?
There you go. Perfect.
Great.
Now
Hi,
we can hear you.
everybody. My name is Jennifer. I'm from the Pennsylvania Health Access Network. I appreciate you staying on a couple minutes past 2 to hear this really important call to action. FAN is going to be sending around a sign-on letter to the Pennsylvania congressional delegation. We've sent a bunch of emails about this the past couple weeks, so you might have seen it already. A lot of what's in the letter is actually what Margarita talked about, so thanks for setting me up for that, for a really nice transition. We're asking for the Pennsylvania congressional delegation for a couple of things for Medicaid in the next couple rounds of stimulus bills. We'd like to increase the federal medical assistance percentage, the FMAP, which is the federal government's percentage that they pay into Medicaid as a state-federal partnership. We want to continue the maintenance of effort requirements that Margarita talked about to ensure that states who receive this new money can't make it harder for people to receive Medicaid. We want to continue all of this funding through the duration of the economic recession and not just an economic crisis, not just the health crisis, because we know the economic crisis will go much longer than the immediate health crisis. We want to make sure that we postpone the scheduled reduction in the CHIP enhanced match. That's a really wonky provision that we're asking for, but basically we want to make sure that folks who utilize CHIP can get the amount that they need without any issues. And then we want to make sure that they consider unrestricted funding to states and municipalities to offset costs in our public health infrastructure. We have a really great list of folks who are already signed on to this letter. I believe Katie posted the link to the letter in the chat right now, and we'd love for you to sign on if you are able to. Our deadline is almost right now, so if you can do it right now, that would be really great. We're asking for people who are representatives of their organization to sign on. This is not an individual letter, and we're asking you to sign on if you have authorization from your organization to represent these folks. So that's usually from like executive team members or folks who are in leadership to be able to sign on. If you have questions, feel free to email me. My email is jennifer@pahealthaccess.org. And I can answer questions, but thank you, Jeff, for letting me really quickly go through all the important stuff in the last 2 minutes. I appreciate it.
Sure, Jennifer, we're always glad to help out and have you here with us. So that's pretty much wrapping up our call today. We will continue to send you information as things start to move forward to wrap up a complete state budget for the fiscal year. Throughout the summer, I'm also going to be inviting you to some Zoom meetings and Zoom chats where we will be talking about this federal effort. Right now, one of the biggest things that you and your organizations and your friends, neighbors, family can do to help us have a complete and well-funded state budget is to advocate at the federal level to Congress for this kind of significant economic relief and recovery that state and local governments will need in order to avoid cuts later on in the year. I would encourage you, if you're able to join me over the summer, as we have some of these periodic Zoom meetings, to do so and to continue to follow along with the 99% PA, take action where you can. And again, in the chat box there, you will see Katie did put in the link to the FAN call to action sign-on letter. So please take a moment to send that there. Thanks to everyone on our PBPC team for helping out here today, Kadita and Katie. I want to thank again Margarita, and thank you to Mark for his presentation as well. Thank you, Jennifer, and thanks everyone for the great questions. Have a great day, and we'll talk with you again over the summer. Bye.